Hello everyone. Yesterday I posted a video on the channel about writing literature reviews, which was the second part in potentially a series of videos about academic projects, academic work, writing, studying. And I received a comment under that video about writing literature reviews that requested me to talk about taking notes, note-taking. And I'm kind of happy to receive these surprising requests because it makes me realize that my audience, at least a substantial portion of my audience, shares my philosophical inclinations. And by that, I mean the inclination to take a very commonplace concept or activity, something that is very straightforward and simple and obvious to most people, and see the strangeness in it and recognize that we don't actually fully understand what it is, how we should engage with it, and what are the best ways of engaging with it. So this is a philosophical temperament that I appreciate in other people, and I'm very happy to have in my audience these kinds of the questions that reveal this tendency. So I should begin this video, this very informal discussion, by saying that I think one of the worst people to talk about this topic, because when I was a student, I was not a fan of taking notes during lectures. During lectures, I didn't have anything in my hands. I would just listen. I would just watch the teacher, the professor, and that's partly because of my own personal tendency that I'm not interested just in the information conveyed by the speaker. I'm a big fan of just watching people, watching their mannerisms. So I was very interested in quote unquote analyzing the character of my professors. That was part of my kind of learning process, educational process. And another reason why I was not big on note taking was I was very insistent on taking always the least efficient path to learning something, to doing my coursework. I was very aggressively inefficient at all times. Given the choice of reading a few pages of notes and reading a big textbook, I would always go with the textbook. Even though I didn't have time to finish a textbook, I would just read a couple of chapters, and I would just focus on reading a few chapters from a textbook rather than reading a summary. That might have been a little bit foolish because my grades in most of my courses were not very high. I wasn't at the top of the class, but so that's just a note about my lack of experience as a student. When I was a student, when I was listening to lectures, I was not taking notes. But I do have a few things to say about notes taking, especially because when I read, I do take a lot of notes, especially when I have the intention of doing something with what I'm reading and exploring different ways of understanding a text. So let's begin. Now, this is going to be our formal starting point for the conversation. I'm going to begin with a very literal approach with note taking. Taking notes is a response to a situation. Something is going on. Either you're reading something or you're listening to something, and you decide for whatever reason to keep a record of what is going on. Okay, so that's our starting point. Note-taking is keeping a record. Keeping a record of something that is going on, and we have a grasp of it. We have enough grasp of what is going on that we can take some notes about it. We can put down some report of it. But that grasp that I just talked about, that grasp of the situation that enables our note-taking, is not just one way. We don't just have one way of grasping a situation. We can go through at least 3 different stages of grasping the situation, understanding a lecture or understanding information in a piece of writing, in a textbook, chapter of a textbook. The first time you're reading a textbook or the first time we are being introduced to a topic, our view of it is most likely in terms of bits and pieces. We see not the big picture, not an organized, coherent whole, but instead bits and pieces. Maybe we are being introduced to concepts some terms, technical terms, and the definition of those terms for the first time. So we take those bits and pieces and we write them down. At this first stage, note-taking is quite easy. The second stage is where we start to see associations and connections and similarities and dissimilarities, and we start to connect those bits and pieces with each other. So in that second stage, writing becomes a little bit more difficult, a little bit more effortful, and it's more of an expression of your own learning rather than just recording things that you're passively receiving from the environment, from external sources. So you detect, identify connections, and you write down those connections in terms of similarity, dissimilarity, pattern, inclusion of terms and concepts under a bigger umbrella in whatever form, just connections, associations. And writing now becomes a little bit more exciting and a little bit more effortful. The third stage, third and maybe last for our discussion, is where you start to see something like a big picture, some kind of coherence, some organization among the bits and pieces. Now, you see not just pieces of the puzzle, but the picture of the puzzle. And at this stage, writing becomes very exciting. You can experience a lot of joy when you grasp that organization, that coherence, that kind of insight, and you start writing down. But at this stage, writing takes more effort. And you might even experience a kind of impatience with that writing because it takes a bit of time to express in words what you might grasp initially in terms of a picture. You see a big picture, and that might be a visual experience. An experience of grasping an organized whole and then putting that down in words and sentences and propositions. So that's a little bit more effortful. So we have our thinking and our understanding of a situation goes through stages. That's my argument. That's what I'm inviting you to consider, this, that we don't have just one way of grasping. We have something like stages of development in our understanding of a subject matter, of a topic, from least organized, piecemeal, to very organized, and organized in ways that might be more personal to you. It's a discovery of an organization. So our thinking moves from less organized to more organized, relatively more organized. The next thing that I invite you to consider is that the act of writing itself helps that movement. When you write, you facilitate the movement from just seeing bits and pieces and elements to seeing coherence and organizations and connections. So when you write down the bits and pieces, you allow yourself to look at them and you increase the likelihood of seeing new connections that you didn't see before, and new ways of organizing these concepts and observations and facts in ways that you didn't see before you wrote down those bits and pieces of the puzzle. So writing, in other words, writing is thinking. What I'm talking about now is that to look at writing as an external expression of thinking that relies on some tools for keeping an external record of our thinking, signs of our thinking. And this idea of writing as a form of thinking is discussed by many people. The one that I remember the most and I go back to the most is a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto. I think he is still there, and that is Professor Keith Oatley. I believe he has one paper with that title. One of his articles is simply called Writing as Thinking. So the point there is that when you begin writing something, when you begin keeping a record of something, you facilitate the movement of going from just passively looking at a set of facts, things that you're just observing, you're taking in, to more organized, more in-depth, more coherent picture, a more insightful, an in-depth way of grasping a subject, grasping a topic. That is why, it is because writing is thinking that a writing assignment is a component in most college courses and most university courses. Every course that you take, it usually has a written assignment because they want you, the instructors, the professors, they want you to practice this movement with the help of writing, this movement from bits and pieces of information to going to a place where you have an insight about them, insight about a connection, about an organization of concepts. it is completely natural, normal for most students to not know that about themselves, to have this ability hidden from their own view. They don't know that when they write, when they take notes, and it begins with note-taking. Most students don't know that they are capable of going from just taking notes to reaching an insight, reaching an understanding. And because they don't know, they don't write. And they only write when it is about keeping a record of what the professor says, just in order to do well in exam, to hold on in memory, external memory, and later internal memory, the things that the professor said, because that's going to come in exam. Most students, unfortunately, don't have the kind of faith and trust in themselves that if they write, it is in nature, it is in the character of the human mind, that whether you like it or not, once you put bits and pieces of information on a piece of paper, it doesn't have to be just one page, multiple pages, and then you go through them, you reconsider those bits and pieces, it is in the character of the human mind that you will either discover some kind of order, some kind of structure and coherence, some organization in them, or you impose an organization more creatively. But it requires faith and trust in yourself, and it requires patience and staying with it a little bit. You have to not demand that it happens immediately. You have to start small, one step at a time, and before you know it, some kind of magic is going to happen. You will start seeing some connections that maybe the professor didn't mention before, something that you are seeing for the first time. And the more you experience this, the more inclined you will be to do it first, to initiate it next time, because you will tell yourself that, yeah, last time I started taking notes and then I saw something. I reached a new understanding. So now I'm going to start this assignment or this project for my own enjoyment, for my own curiosity. I'm going to start by just keeping a record of the things that I read about this topic or about this question. And I'm going to go through them after a while. I'm going to go through them, reconsider them, and see what will arise out of that, what will emerge out of your notes. So your notes are, the way you look at your notes, it's not just a computer-like, machine-like record of what happened, but more like a fertile ground of a garden. Your notes are like a fertile ground out of which plants will grow, and those plants will bear fruits and flowers, and you will enjoy those fruits, which are insights and new forms of understanding. Okay, I hope this addressed your question and concern to some degree, and thank you again for your question.